I'm Matt Booker.
I'm Dave Laird, and welcome to episode 61 of Concavity Show. Well, Matt, how's it going, bud?
Good to be back, Dave. We have a very special episode today. I'm very excited about it.
We do. It doesn't sound that exciting right now because it's just the two of us so far. However, we recently were joined by three very special guests to record, I would say, what was, a pretty memorable conversation with one of the great living American authors, Steve Erickson.
For sure. I was very excited to get the opportunity to have him on our show. I think that he is an appreciated author and not as well known as he should be. So it's really a dream to have someone as accomplished as him and, someone who I would really admire on the show. And, not only, like you said, do we have a really special guest for this episode, we also have two special guest interviewers who are both the editors of a new volume out from the University of Mississippi Press called Conversations with Steve Erickson. And like all the other books in the series, it is a collection of interviews with a prominent author. And, we're familiar with the Conversations with David Foster Wallace book edited by Stephen Byrne.
That was actually the first non-Wallace book that I ever bought.
Wow.
I was in Powell's bookstore in Portland, Oregon in 2012, and I saw Conversations with David Foster Wallace, and I was like, whoa, what is this? And I saw The Legacy of David Foster Wallace. Lee Constantinos edited that, Sam Cohen. And so I bought both of them on the spot, and those were like my intro to Wallace studies, basically. There's also, I was looking at the website for this series. It's nuts. There's like 18, 20 pages on their website of all the titles. There's also Conversations with Don DeLillo, Paul Auster, Flannery O'Connor, Kurt Vonnegut, Toni Morrison, Volman, Le Guin, Allen Ginsberg, Colson Whitehead, Nabokov, Lethem, Eudora Welty. Like, it's endless, and it's all really, really great.
It is, and the interviews are really top notch. They've been edited. They come from a variety of sources. In this book with Steve Erickson, there are interviews, multiple with Michael Silverblatt, also with The Believer magazine. Interviews
Larry McCaffrey,
Rick Moody,
familiar face. Joshua Cohen. Alec Baldwin even has one.
And that's actually one of my
from
favorites.
His podcast.
Right? Here's the thing.
It's really good, isn't it?
If you haven't listened to Alec Baldwin's podcast, which I think is now defunct, called Here's the Thing, I really like it. I think Alec Baldwin is a good interviewer, a good conversationalist, and he really had a great time, obviously, with Steve Erickson on the show.
Yeah.
So anyways, you get a good selection of these interviews, and today, in a way, we're really contributing to that with having Steve Erickson be interviewed by the editors of the Conversations with Steve Erickson book. So it's
Mike. I think either Mike or Matt joked after that this interview will be in volume 2 of the Conversations with Steve Erickson. It's a little late to fit it into the initial one.
So Matt and Mike are not only friends of the show, have been on this show multiple times. They're both prominent scholars in their own right, have multiple books, have done many conference papers on David Foster Wallace, published articles in prominent journals on Wallace. Matt Luter is also the author of Understanding Jonathan Lethem. And Mike Miley has a new book out last year or the year before.
Last year.
Called Truth and Consequences, which is about game shows in fiction and film. So those books are incredible and really just, they span a broad variety of topics, as does Erickson himself in his fiction. And in our bonus episode, we also have a bonus episode for our Patreon subscribers. We talk about we asked Steve Erickson his favorite novels, and I would say you and I do that part of the interview. So
yes, so it's kind of a two-parter, but Mike Miley and Matt Luter handle the like big main talk about his body of work and influence and all that
right
stuff.
And part of the reason we wanted to invite them on the show too is like, I don't consider myself to be a Steve Erickson expert, and I have not read all of his books and everything that he's written a ton. He's got 10 books, 2 nonfiction books, and a lot of political journalism. He has a degree in journalism. He's written for years, for decades, for LA Weekly, film reviews, blog stuff. I mean, he's a very prolific writer. And
he was a UCLA film studies major too. So like he's got like a really broad background.
Right. And he's an LA writer. Mike Miley used to live in LA, and so it's just a golden opportunity for us to have people who are experts to do this interview, this conversation with him. And as I was listening to this interview, I really felt like, as a fan of what I have read of Erickson's book, and we discussed his book Shadowbahn extensively in 2018 in our year-end list.
And then in 19, because then I read it after you mentioned it,
okay.
and it was like my favorite book that I read that year.
And we've discussed his work some here, but it's like I say, just really great to have people who are true experts in it and in interviewing him and their familiarity with every interview question he's ever been asked. We couldn't pass up the opportunity to kind of put 2 and 2 together there.
Exactly. Totally.
And so before we get into the main interview today with Steve Erickson, I did want to read a bit for people who aren't familiar with his work or have never heard him interviewed before. I wanted to give a little bit of context from the introduction to the Conversations book, which is co-written. The introduction's co-written by Mike Miley and Matt Luter. So if it's okay, I'm just going to dig into that a bit. Mike and Matt write, Erickson's obscurity comes in part from the difficulty of categorizing his work neatly within current trends in fiction, and in part from the wide variety of concerns that populate his writing: literature, music, film, politics, history, time, and the multifaceted city of Los Angeles. His unique, dream-fueled blend of European modernism, American pulp, and paranoid late-century metafiction makes him simultaneously essential to an appreciation of the last 40 years of American fiction, and difficult to classify within that same realm. He is at once thoroughly of his time and distinctly outside it. These are movies that make no sense at all, and we understand them completely. That's a quote. In defining what he calls the cinema of hysteria, the film critic who narrates Amnesiascope, Erickson's most autobiographical novel, may as well be summarizing Erickson's own aesthetic. The critic's commitment to hysterical film in what seems a hysterical age emphasizes how Erickson's own work operates more through the logic of lucid dreams than linear causes and rational effects. In an age riddled with uncertainty, the narrator continues, the undercurrent of the age pulls us to an irrational truth, for which only an irrational cinema is sufficient. Similarly, while Erickson's work does not offer art as an easy solution to all that ails a soul or a nation, it does posit that fiction is necessary to an understanding of our shared chaotic present, and vice versa. So I thought that was a great passage from the introduction. I think it really does kind of summarize how Erickson's preoccupations with dreams, with LA, with movies, with music, with kind of the soul of America. And we get into all of that in the interview. Thanks to Mike Miley and Matt Luter for leading this discussion, for putting this book together. It's really an honor to have all three of them on our show here.
Totally. It's a great read. And a fun fact is that this book, the week that it came out, it was the #1 new release in postmodern literary criticism on Amazon. Not that we want to promote Amazon on this show, but like that's pretty cool that they hit the top of the charts there.
Yeah, it does tell you a lot about, I think about Erickson's popularity, and
Sure.
he is truly a living legend in a lot of ways, a master of his craft. He teaches creative writing at University of California, Riverside. He also founded the journal Black Clock back in, I think, 2004, when shortly after David Foster Wallace had moved to Pomona, California, and Wallace contributed a story to Erickson's journal Black Clock, which is named after tours of the Black Clock. And that story was Oblivion, and we do talk about that a bit in the interview, I believe. So,
yeah, it comes up. Yeah, Erickson's gotten acclaim from writers like Pynchon, Wallace, Lethem, Dana Spiotta, Haruki Murakami. Wallace called Erickson the cream of the crop, so that's a pretty good endorsement. And I haven't seen the film for Zeroville, but in 2019, James Franco, Seth Rogen, Megan Fox, Danny McBride, Craig Robinson starred in an adaptation of Erickson's book Zeroville. Have you seen that?
No, but based on the reviews, I would recommend the book over the movie.
Yeah, that's sort of the sense I got too, poking around looking at that.
It's James Franco. Not a huge fan, to be honest with you.
Matt Luter texted us the next day after this interview, and in which Matt and I were present for it. We just hit mute and we didn't record ourselves at all. So we just sat back and just watched the three of them talk, and it was great. And it was also challenging to do that, to not try and jump in, because I had a lot of thoughts, right? But Luter texted our group, and he said, "It is only now dawning on me that we interviewed one of the greatest living American novelists last night." And we were all just like, "Yep, that's pretty right on for what happened." So
enjoy. We hope you like it, and we have a little bit more after the interview, and we will let Mike.
We'll see you then. We'll be back in a bit for some housekeeping.
I'm Mike Miley, and we're here with Steve Erickson to talk in part about the collection of interviews that Matt Luter and I put together called Conversations with Steve Erickson, that's out now. But more excitingly, there's a new work of Erickson's that we have to talk about that is not covered in the collection, and that is a work online called American Stutter. And so I thought it would be great to start off talking about that work in particular, and then use that as a window into the rest of your work, Steve, because I think it is a really good introduction to a lot of the concerns that run throughout your work, but also one that I think gives readers a really timely entry point into sort of into your ideas, because it's things that are happening now, but things that have been concerning you for decades. And what I'm wondering about, I guess, to start, is simply just how did American Stutter come about?
Well, first of all, Mike and Matt, I want to thank you guys for doing the book. I really appreciate it. I want to thank you for doing this interview. I really appreciate that. American Stutter began as a journal, and to those who read it, it's still in journal form. It was sort of long and rambling, and it was the product of things that were going on in my life and things that were going on in the life of the country, and this general sense of unraveling, if you will, both personally and nationally. And I had no thought of it necessarily being a bigger work later. In fact, I kind of made a point of jettisoning that possibility, because I didn't want to be writing to that end. I just wanted to put down what I was really thinking and what I was really feeling about things going on, and then later on, I wound up cutting it by quite a bit. I think that what you see now is probably about 25% of what I wrote, in part because there were times when I was repeating myself, and there were times when I was getting into weeds that nobody cares about right now. Bernie Sanders won such and such a percentage of the Latino vote in the Nevada caucus, that kind of thing, that I didn't think was going to be especially relevant to readers now, because I wasn't writing a campaign book as such. I was writing what I hoped was a bigger story about not just the campaign, about not even just Donald Trump, but about America. And a key line for me in the journal was that Donald Trump didn't happen to America. America happened to America, and that this has been coming for a while.
Yeah, and I guess to give listeners a broader context, the American Stutter is literally a journal of, I guess, starting in the fall of 2019, I guess is where it begins,
summer.
And then
going
up until right now, or I guess yesterday's, when I looked at it, the most recent entry was for August 6th, right? And so, it winds up being a really raw work where it does bear some resemblance to your campaign work like Leap Year and American Nomad, but also has the feel of something like Amnesiascope, but even some of the more recent novels as well. And so I guess another thing to ask about that is in the editing process of paring it down, what sort of guided the decisions? So you're talking about, on the one hand, not wanting things to be in the weeds too much, but were you writing the emotion more in what to choose to keep, or how did you go about paring it down?
It was pretty much a question of what I thought the reader would still care about, and what the big picture was. And to the extent that my own story, interweaves with the political story, I felt like, that was important insofar as it informed the other. That is, I didn't want this to be any more indulgent than it had to be, and those are the kinds of decisions that I think any writer winds up making about any kind of a book, and decisions that almost necessarily get harder the longer you're working on the work, because you're getting closer and closer to it, and you're struggling more and more to maintain the perspective that is going to best serve what it is you want to say to the reader.
And I'm interested in it also not just in terms of content, but also form, right? Because it is doing this really interesting thing of starting very close to the present, and then going back to 2019, working forward. It's guided by, I love that metaphor of the how do we pronounce this word? Hallucinix? Sure.
Yes. Sure. Why not?
Which, I mean, we're not certain how to pronounce it, because it may or may not be a fictional word, right? So we get some of these kind of surreal touches creeping in also. So how do you arrive at, while keeping it in this diary form, something that also sort of is letting fiction creep in, is playing with chronology a little bit? What guides those formal choices as much as the content ones?
Right, and I mean, as I think you might imagine, it kind of comes naturally to me to mix the fictional and the non-fictional, and if I had to explain a strategy behind it, I guess it would be that no reader should ever take any narrator entirely at face value. That all narrators are to some extent, at least a little bit, unreliable, and also because I tend to sometimes think impressionistically rather than historically or even in a purely literary sense. So, as to the decisions of what to keep and what to lose and when for the larger thing to take this form or that form, the longer that a person does this, and I've been doing it a while now, the more I think those choices become instinctive, and the writer responds to those decisions instinctively, and then may question himself as to why. Why is my instinct telling me to make this particular choice? So it's not all entirely either rational or irrational. One of the things that I teach students is that if you're gonna be a writer, first of all, you probably better be in it for the long haul. That one of the things you learn is how to trust your instincts, and the other thing you learn is how to distinguish your instincts from your ego. So that if your instincts are telling you you're always right, then they're lying, and you've got to know, when that is the case and when it isn't.
Sure.
Well, that's especially hard, I guess, in a piece that is so thoroughly personal, right? The instinct and the ego.
It's very personal, and yes, that's exactly true. The collision between instinct and ego, and who am I being fair to and who am I not being fair to, and at least a lot of the time, if not most of the time, am I being toughest on myself, or am I willing to be toughest on myself? Because if I'm not, then I'm not sure I've earned the right to judge others in the work.
I'll tell you also that intensity of it that you're kind of speaking to there was one of the things that really struck me the most about American Stutter. It is, I think it would be fair to say, at times a pretty angry piece of writing, but very righteously so.
Right.
There's anger at exploitation, at racism, at poor leadership. But anger is difficult to write about, is risky to write about. So how do you approach it?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I don't have a pat answer for it. Except to ask whether the anger was called for, and most of the time I thought it was, and to at least try and balance that outwardly directed anger with some interior examination, and to what extent am I culpable in something. And that wasn't always clear to me, and part of the inward journey of this thing was figuring that out.
And do you feel like by the end that writing this piece helped clarify this past year and a half, or any of these events, or maybe clarified particular ones and others remain a mystery? I mean, 'cause certainly trying to make sense of the last 18 months is a pretty tall order, and other than to simply be upset about it. But do you feel like you've reached a clearer vision of any of it at this point?
Well, if I have, it's not a better vision. I mean, it's a and I try to check against just glib pessimism, because I hear a lot of that. I think look, novelists are predisposed to being melodramatic, and apocalyptic novelists are predisposed to being apocalyptic, and but the reality is, without melodrama and without apocalypse, I think that democracy is in a somewhat dire place right now. I think that a lot is at stake. I think that the next few years are going to tell the tale. I spent some of the time reading other histories about other burgeonings, if you will, of authoritarianism or even fascism. And so I think I may have just gained more clarity on that, more than anything else, getting back to that visceral quality of it. I felt the need to address all this. And so, when I had finished this, for instance, and New York publishers were hinting that, well, you really need to kind of tone things down, or especially given the post-pandemic bottleneck of publishing right now, maybe we'll get this out in 2023. That just didn't cut it. And that's why I made the choice, for instance, to publish it online at the site Journal of the Plague Year, which is an online magazine. It doesn't preclude that at some point later it couldn't come out in some kind of print form, but this was something I felt driven to say, and that I felt driven to tell people, not presuming for a moment that what I say necessarily matters to anybody. I think that all remains to be seen.
Well, and I certainly think that going through it in the form that it's in certainly captures the feeling of reliving it. I know that the three or the four of us, when we've been reading it and rereading it, have just been commenting on, oh God, that happened this year too.
Right,
oh,
yeah.
Where there was this, and the reading it in the form that you have it, really it does feel like one thing after another,
Yeah.
but also these things that had been forgotten or suppressed sort of resurfacing, and
Yeah.
we really are reliving the year alongside you. Even and sort of remembering things we don't want to remember, and even that, it's rough going, but it also has a bit of a catharsis in a weird way to kind of experience it and realize, okay, that did all happen to me, and I am still here trying to make sense of it.
Right. Yeah. Often the material dictates the form, and it just seemed clear to me to leave it in the form of a journal for all the reasons that you just alluded to. That the sense of unfolding, and this kind of astonished, or maybe a better word is stupefied, sense that so much of this went down over these last two years, and that we're still in the throes of a lot of it, if not all of it. I mean, whether it's the pandemic or racism or the fate of democracy itself.
And particularly the sense that all of that was getting intertwined. That there was, right. Because these things are connected, and it was, when I think about that year, it is striking, and reading this really brought it back, how those sort of parallel strands of, we've got a pandemic, we've got an election, we've got reckoning with racial injustice in history, all of that happening simultaneously. The intensity of that, yeah.
And that I think also in a way I'm not sure I can totally articulate, but all of that sort of justified in my mind putting it to some extent in the context of my real life, because I knew that everybody was leading real lives. We were all leading lives where there were things going on, big things going on, some of which had nothing to do with all the rest of that, but some of which did.
And the underlying tension of so much of it between individualism and a sense of a shared societal duty.
Yeah, exactly. The social contract.
And I think you capture a lot of that really well in the sense of, well, how helpless an individual can feel, especially when they are imbued with such a sense of civic duty, or,
Right.
I think you capture that incredibly well, and we're experiencing that in a region where we've been, in a country we've been brought up to think like, oh well, that's, your feeling of citizenship is sort of like is enough, right? Or that the work that you do in there is going to be what makes it great, and and sort of hitting a moment when that isn't enough. Right. And then it reminds me too, I guess, the way that you're talking about when Matt brought up the idea of all of these things being intertwined. I think this is something in your work that you often don't get enough credit for, is the way that you have shown so many of these things to be intertwined throughout your career, whether that's in Arc to X or or in Tours of the Black Clock, or so many of the works where you have real life historical events brushing shoulders with the fictional. So often it intersects around ideas of nation, ideas of race, and then the sense of the fantastic or the impossible happening, which is all of those things I could just as well be describing 2020 and describing American Stutter. And so, I mean, this is something that, maybe the real world counterpart of it is very new to people, but not necessarily new to your readership and to your work. And I guess because your work has often been sort of about that intersection between the fictional past and the more kind of real seeming received historical past. And since it's been something you've been working on for so long, what about that intersection interests you particularly, or what about it is so important?
Well, I think that I'm more inclined to think that psychodrama creates history rather than the other way around. I mean, the Marxist view, and I'm not a Marxist, but the Marxist view is that we're all the product of history, and there is some truth in that. But I think it's just as true, if not more true, that history is the product of us, and all of these, all of these psychodramatic events that are unique to us. I mean, in a book like, especially the one that comes to my mind, Tours of the Black Clock, history is very much driven by, what is happening on this primal level in individual lives, and America in particular, feels like a good example of that. Going back to, as you mentioned, that baked in conflict between the individual and the social, and a conflict that never really gets reconciled, and maybe it shouldn't be reconciled. Maybe there is no easy pat reconciliation, and maybe that is what. Maybe that's what makes America unique, and it remains to be seen whether it's also what ultimately dooms America, if whether or not it can reconcile that conflict between our individual histories and the history that we hold in common. So a lot of this, is a lot of the fiction, as you say, does take place at that intersection among history and culture, and identity and individuality, and it's just a theme that has come naturally to me, and why that is, I probably need to go to a therapist for, but it's sort of has been a part of the work from the beginning.
Well, I have several kind of questions I want to go to from there, but the one that I've been wanting to ask for quite a long time that hasn't popped up into a lot of the interviews that we see in the collection that I'm really curious about is, of all the major American historical events that you will write about, whether that's Jefferson or whether in the case of Shadowbahn, the events around the Kennedy assassination or 9/11. One that you return to frequently is the Robert Kennedy assassination. Mm-hmm. And it's in Rubicon Beach. It's in These Dreams of You. I think you might also speak about it in some of the campaign work. And it's interesting to me because both in Rubicon Beach and in These Dreams of You, that event gets positioned as a critical hinge point of sorts in American history. But generally in the general public mind, the Kennedy assassination that is the hinge point is John Kennedy's assassination.
Right.
And so I wanted to ask you about why, at least in your fiction, you seem to see a different Kennedy assassination as a significant turning point.
That is a great question that I don't recall anybody else asking me. I'm traditional enough to believe that all good writing, whatever form it takes, however experimental it may strike some, and as you may know by now, that's a word I really hate. But I think that most good fiction is character driven, and if you're a novelist, Robert Kennedy is easily the most fascinating of the Kennedys because he's the guy who changes. And he's the guy who starts out one thing, and by the time he dies, he's become very much a different sort of man, in part changed by that earlier hinge of his brother's assassination. So I don't know that I would argue that Robert Kennedy's assassination was more important historically than John's assassination was, but from a dramatic standpoint, dealing with a more complicated character who was more reflective, I think, of the changes that America was going through in the 1960s. Robert Kennedy is more interesting to me than any of the others, maybe even more interesting than any public figure I can think of in the 1960s in both positive ways and negative ways. And I find myself as a writer, just as a novelist, trading in drama, if you will. I find myself drawn to him because of that of really profound changes that you certainly don't see in most political figures. And in terms of the 68 campaign, which was obviously cut short by his assassination, he ran the kind of campaign that you just never see now, which is to say he would go to audiences and tell them the thing they did not want to hear. He would go to white audiences and make the case for black rage. He would go to black audiences and make the case for white skepticism. He would tell white audiences, how can you expect, an African American, not that they used that term then, but how can you expect a black American to react any other way to hopelessness? and he would go to black audiences and say, if you're going to burn down your own neighborhoods, what makes you think white people are going to pay attention? He would ask these really hard questions in front of exactly the kind of audience that question needed to be asked to. And on a presidential level, I'm hard pressed to think of another major campaign that was like that. And you have to wonder, had he lived, had that campaign gone on, where it would have wound up and what it would have said about America in winding up there.
I do really enjoy hearing you sort of describe these sort of historical events as symbolic moments, and even as things that sort of start to take on power just as an abstract idea or an image within a piece of fiction.
Right.
And this happens so often in your work, not just with historical moments, but with putting to use other earlier artworks, earlier images. And there are so many things we see in your work where there's maybe a really strong single image that a novel's built around, like the beheading in Rubicon Beach, like the Twin Towers in Shadowbahn. But there's also a lot of things where there is an earlier text that figures really strongly. In Zeroville, there's all of the fantastic discussion of A Place in the Sun, of Passion of Joan of Arc, O Shenandoah in Shadowbahn. How do you sort of choose or settle on something like that? If you're going to, in such a really interesting way, lean really hard on a single historical moment or existing text, where does it's A Place in the Sun? How does that sort of thing happen?
Yeah, well, that does really get us into the language of instinct, and then later on, part of the process of writing the novel is figuring out, where that image of the Twin Towers reappearing in the Badlands came from, or why did it come to me? What does it mean? Because these things do lend themselves to metaphor, and most great historical events pretty easily lend themselves to metaphor. A lot of times it will be a matter of finishing a novel, and it's gone to press and it's been published, and 6 months later I think of something that I could have included, and that becomes the germ of the next thing. And especially as I get older, I've learned I don't jump on these little inspirations or brainstorms right away. I let them kind of percolate in my brain for a while. I need to gather the psychic energy to write a book, which is an endeavor. And sometimes it's easier and sometimes it's harder. A lot of times, as I was saying before, in character-driven fiction, the characters make decisions for me. There was something about A Place in the Sun that made sense being tattooed on that guy's head. I like A Place in the Sun, but it's not one of my 10 favorite movies. I'm not sure it's one of my 50 favorite movies, but there was something about this guy that it made sense for him to have Elizabeth Taylor and Montgomery Clift on his head. And a lot of those choices that are talked about in the novel are talked about because I thought they would tell us something about they would tell the reader something about the character, as opposed to necessarily telling the reader something about me or my personal taste. So some of these things are intuitive. Some of them are dictated by the material itself as it unfolds. I do subscribe to the idea that I write a novel to find out what it's about in the same way the reader reads it for that reason. At which point I then have to go back often and do a lot of rewriting and readdressing. And there always comes a point in the writing of the novel, or the rewriting of the rewriting, or the rewriting of the rewriting of the rewriting, when you have to say, this is enough. I'm going to think this thing to death if I don't let go of it. And that sometimes is a harder thing to do than you might think.
Well, and I do love you speak a lot about this in the interviews in the collection, about how you do sort of write kind of blind without an outline, and then you can see also how in the rewriting you're able to preserve that feeling while also having this sort of intense continuity of images and symbols and things like that make it feel sort of simultaneously spontaneous and completely planned out. I don't know of that many other reading experiences that are like that. And something I wanted to ask to follow up on Matt's question about the texts. Some of your novels, like Zeroville and Shadowbahn, also have these, in addition to dealing with real texts like real films or real songs in the world, also have these sort of almost mythic texts that all of those texts are a part of or are contributing to. I'd love to hear you say more about that. Do you, I guess this is the corny way to ask it, but do you believe that there is an text? Are you looking for one in yourself, or how? Because that comes about in lots of your work. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, I'm always drawing from the same stream of consciousness, or the same stream of unconsciousness, as it will. And so, sure, there is a commonality. You could call it an text. Another interviewer in one of the interviews that you guys included in your book calls it the multiverse of the novels, and that stuff has always come naturally to me, to kind of keep drawing from that same stream. Now, the frightening thing, if you're a novelist, is that as you get older and as you write more novels, that stream gets narrower and narrower and narrower and runs more and more slowly. And, I'm afraid I do believe that inspiration is finite, and the well will not continue bubbling up at the same velocity forever. But I keep drawing from it, and beyond that, I'd love to tell you I had some kind of master plan, up on the wall, but it's not like that, and a lot of these things, are kind of subconscious. I have certainly had the experience of people asking me about connections between my books that I was not aware of. You got this guy doing this on page 139 of this book, and this guy doing the same thing on page 283 of this book, and they seem to have this in common. And they may not be wrong, but I'm as clueless about a lot of that as the next person. I mean, particularly in Japan, where I've done a couple of book tours, and my books do fairly well. I mean, the interviewing is always way smarter than I am. And has an understanding of and a comprehension of what I'm doing that I don't.
Yeah, those a couple that are in the book are really sharp. Those are some really good ones. in there, the ones from Japan.
For sure, yeah. They're very smart there.
Some of what you're saying about writing from instinct versus sort of doing the planning out an outline for a book as a different model that is less your model makes me wonder about your experiences teaching creative writing and working with aspiring writers. I'd love to hear just a bit more about your approach to teaching creative writing. Do you encourage aspiring writers to sort of work from that instinctual mode, or if you're working in a more formal workshop setting, does that sort of wind up requiring a little less instinctual work? What's your experience like with supporting that kind of work?
Yes, all of the above. I mean, it leaves me an occasionally conflicted teacher because I'm wondering, how much structure to give these guys and how much to leave to them the structuring of their own writing lives. And there is a difference between teaching aspiring writers at the graduate level. They've made a certain leap, as opposed to students at an undergraduate level, where sometimes my methods are not always conventional and maybe occasionally controversial. For instance, in the case of a fiction writing class, I never give them deadlines. If it was a journalism class, I'd give them a deadline, because if you're going to go out there and be a journalist, you've got to learn how to adhere to a deadline. But if you're going to go out there and be a fiction writer, you've got to learn how to make your own deadline. There's nobody going to be calling you up saying, when's that next short story coming through, and that does throw some students for a loop. The sense of they want a more defined structure, and I'm reluctant to give them one, because that's one of the things they're going to have to learn to construct for themselves, and so I'm constantly trying to find that balance between the too much structure and too little structure, between instinct and ego, between encouragement and the slap of reality, if you will. In the first class I teach in any quarter, I always bring in a pile of my novels, and I raise the first one, Days Between Stations. This one was rejected 12 times. I raised the next one, Zeroville. This is my so-called hit novel. This was rejected 9 times. Shadowbahn, maybe my most acclaimed novel. This one was rejected 6 times. I want them to know. I want them to know what they're going to be facing when they get out there, and if they're not ready for that, and if they're not ready to make their own structure, to make their own deadlines, to create their own regimen, to do all that, they should not be writers. I'm sometimes loath to put it that bluntly, because it could come off as cruel, and that's the last thing that I intend. The teaching of writing is challenging, because you cannot teach talent, you cannot teach inspiration, you can't teach any of that. You can teach craft, and that's about it. And one of the biggest things you cannot teach is character, and that plays a pretty huge role in the work and in doing the work.
So with all that in mind, what are some of the go-to models that you use? What are the texts show up in those workshop courses as models either for particular elements of craft, or just here are, things that every young writer should read?
I do give them a reading list. I let them know, again, like the deadlines, it's not required. It's for their edification. There are examples of the way, a work is defined by voice. There are examples of the way a work is defined by the landscape. Paul Bowles' Sheltering Sky. Africa is the main character. And there are ways in which a work is defined by perspective or structure or pure plot, or character, even in a book that would seem to be pure plot. As Raymond Chandler continued writing from novel to novel and novel, his plots become less important, and the character of Marlowe becomes more important. Even in a plot-driven, what is considered a plot-driven genre. So yeah, there are. I do have a number of kind of defined texts that give them examples of each of these things that they're going to encounter as they learn to be writers. Scott Fitzgerald's Tender as the Night, for instance, is published in two different forms. In America, it opens with what we would consider part one, and then it goes into a kind of a flashback in part two. And well, the version that was published in England, those first two parts are flipped, and it's told chronologically. Because Malcolm Cowley, who edited, I think, the Penguin editions, particularly after Fitzgerald was gone, was working from notes where Fitzgerald had decided he wanted to revise the structure of a novel that had already been published and that he could not let go of. And if you read the two versions, it's a good example of how the same material is being presented, the same story is being told, but it's being told in a different way, in a different order, and that alters the essence of the story.
I wanted to switch to talk about something you mentioned in American Stutter. This podcast has its origins as a podcast about David Foster Wallace and his work. And one of the big things in, I guess, the Wallace world and Wallace studies in particular is people going down to the University of Texas at Austin to look at his archive at the Harry Ransom Center. Right. And in American Stutter, you mention a university acquiring your papers. I don't know how much you're at liberty to discuss it now, but I wanted to know what more you could tell us about that process and about what stage that's in.
Yeah, I don't know if I should mention the university because it is still in process.
Okay.
No, I mean, I'm still accumulating the stuff. The library in question, and I'll just say it's a well-known Ivy League East Coast university. The library in question is kind of bottlenecked along with the rest of the world of letters, and so it's kind of on hold, especially as some part of me resists doing it, and I haven't quite figured out why. I mean, I'm at the point where it seems to me it would make sense to do it, and so that's kind of where it's at. And I don't mean to be, unduly coy about it, but it's still unfolding.
Since this does also begin as a Wallace, as a David Foster Wallace podcast, and you've worked with Wallace in part when you were the editor of Black Clock, the title story from Oblivion appeared there, and I guess wanted to ask what it was like working with or editing Wallace's work, particularly that story, and maybe how you first encountered his work as well.
I'm trying to think. I started hearing about Wallace, I want to say, back in the mid to late 90s. Would that make sense? Would that be? And he was a somewhat elusive character, but I wound up getting a street address for him. Or maybe it was an email address. Or maybe, actually, now that I'm recreating in my mind, I think I went through his agent, who was out here in Los Angeles, Bonnie Nadell. And she forwarded my request to him just to get some work of his for the first issue of Black Hawk, because I knew that if anything would launch the magazine, that would do it. Time went by, and then I got a postcard from him, and he revealed that he had come to one of my readings, and had not presented himself, and that he was, he liked the work. He mentioned Tours of the Black Hawk in particular, especially since the magazine had taken its name from that. And he offered a story just out of the blue. And, as for editing him, that's not a gift horse you look too far down the throat of, and I pretty much ran it the way he gave it to me.
And that is one of my favorite stories of his as well. It's such a great piece of work.
Hugely generous of him, of course, and it was a big deal for the magazine.
So now the next question, I guess we're going to shift over to, in addition to being a novelist and a great political writer, you also write a lot of great criticism about film and music. And it's one of the many great angles of encountering your work, and also, of course, in the novels, how all of this comes together there. But the other people on this interview are going to roll their eyes at me, but I've been begging them to let me ask you a Dylan question. And so, because there's a lot in our interviews about how transformative Blonde on Blonde and other of those 60s Dylan albums were for you as a novelist. And then I think in works like American Nomad and then in other places, you also write a lot about Frank Sinatra. And so I'm dying to ask you about your thoughts about the more recent trio of Dylan albums, where he does the Sinatra covers.
I've not really listened to them. I wasn't sure I'd be doing either Bob or Frank a favor doing so. But I've heard from people they aren't bad, I guess the most interesting thing to me was that for all the ways that my enthusiasms for Sinatra and Dylan would seem to be at odds with each other, they must not seem that way to Dylan himself when he's recording 3 albums of Sinatra songs. Dylan, later on when we talk about my 5 favorite novels, if I could have stretched the definition, I've talked about this in interviews ad nauseum, I'm sure, is the afternoon that I heard Highway 61 Revisited and Blonde on Blonde back to back, starting like it was a triple album, starting from Like a Rolling Stone to Sad-Eyed Lady of the Lowlands, and that changed my life, and it changed my thinking about art and creativity and the rules that that you can break if you're smart enough and good enough to get away with it, and the way that art is is about possibilities, and possibilities that that you didn't know existed there before. And it changed my life as much as, you know, the novels that I'm going to talk about later. It made me a different writer, and it made me a different person, I think. There was something heroic about it, and I responded to it.
I'm going to press my luck on this as well and ask about Rough and Rowdy Ways, particularly Murder Most Foul, which, you know, may be, dare I say, the most Ericksonian of Dylan's songs. Yeah, but I didn't know, because I know you have written and thought a lot about Dylan, so I'm just sort of dying to know your thoughts about his most recent work.
Yeah, I haven't heard all of that album, but I've heard Murder Most Foul. And, you know, it was, the first time I heard it, I remember my heart kind of sinking at the opening lines, which seemed atypically trite for a Dylan. But then it just gains this kind of power as it goes along. It just builds, and it becomes a cumulative thing. And that was what I was most taken with, and I was also taken with the arrangement. It's almost there's almost a chamber pop quality about it, a classical quality about it, and I'd never heard Dylan record a song like that before.
Thank you. Okay, guys, I'm done asking Dylan questions. But thank you. Thank you for indulging me.
Sure.
We joke about rolling our eyes at Mike asking a Dylan question, but he could well roll his eyes at the music question I've got, which is okay. I admire Shadowbahn a whole lot, and while we're talking about specific music, then I'm so curious about Oh Superman showing up in that novel.
Yeah.
When there is all of the discussion of Ocean and Doa, that sort of makes a clearer sense to me as being present, so present in that book. It's a folk song. Dozens of people have recorded it. It feels like it belongs to the nation in a book that is so much about nation. And then at the same time, the other song, or one of many songs that just keeps showing up, is this weird piece of art pop from Laurie Anderson, and that is a strange thing, a beautiful thing that I love very much, but it's weird. And so, why that song?
Well, you know, I wrote about a lot of songs. One of the major revisions that I made to the novel in its final stages was that I cut a lot of songs, because the novel was becoming much more about music than I intended it to be, and some of those choices were calculated. Oh, Superman was, I don't remember Superman as being a calculated choice. I remember, though, being struck by, you know, I think the germ of that song's inclusion was that there are lines in the song that seem to be about the Twin Towers.
The American planes.
And seem to be about 9/11. Yes, here come the planes. And, of course, the song came out 15 to 20 years before 9/11. And apparently Laurie Anderson had performed that song in front of a concert audience post 9/11, and when she got to that part of the song, there was this collective audible gasp. Suddenly the song became, you know, ascended to this new level of prophecy that it hadn't had before, or it hadn't had insofar as anybody could tell. And then, you know, there was a kind of, there was a because the, you know, because the novel, you know, it abounds maybe to a fault in doubles. There seemed a parallel of "Oh Shenandoah" and "Oh Superman." They kind of rhetorically, they were kind of rhetorical twins, even as they couldn't be more different. And one was a song of American past, and the other was a song of American future, and both were songs of American promise and the way that promise gets broken.
And one sounding so sort of organic, and one sounding so strange and even artificial in an interesting way.
Yeah, but if you keep thinking of it in those terms, then you'll start asking yourself at some point which is which.
Sure. Yeah. Also on the well, and this will bring together, I guess, a lot of the music stuff, but then thinking about movies, literature, all of the various art forms that show up in your work. Mike and I are both big physical media people. I still buy CDs. Right. Mike and I both still buy DVDs. Right. Mike is a huge vinyl guy. I'm getting into that. You mentioned in American Stutter, actually, saving physical media when you were evacuating wildfires. And yet, right. This book, as you mentioned, is initially published digitally, though, as you mentioned, it may also show up in print. Right. Yep. So what are your thoughts on, while we sort of value physical media, like feeling like I feel sometimes like it's fighting a losing battle almost against the digitization of everything. Do you feel that way? What's your sense of what it means to sort of have so much physical media getting sort of gradually replaced by the digital?
I think it's a losing battle. I think that, you know, everybody I know, including my kids, everything comes off that screen, not out of. I think that you know, those of us who read hard copy books were this dwindling cult, you know, that's bound to meet in the middle of the forest under cover of night and give a secret handshake, because nobody else is reading like that. And even in terms of music, because I wind up listening to so much of the music I listen to in the car now is all digitalized. I no longer have a CD collection. It's all on my laptop. The movies, yeah, I've still got a select Blu-ray collection, in large part because Blu-ray is still technically, by a small measure, superior to even HD streaming. You're going to get a better picture. But on the other hand, now you've got this whole new technological thing in movies, which is Ultra HD, and that's one technological twist I'm just not going to keep up with. I mean, I've sort of maxed out on how far I can follow this stuff, and I'm still old school enough that even if the library diminishes, and it does, you know, there's still certain books I want to keep in hardcover. There's still certain movies I want to have hard copies of. But I think that you know, it was naive of me in some ways to write a novel like Shadowbahn, where on the page there are often so many things going on textually and visually, and it didn't occur to me that they were going to put out an e-copy of this book, and a lot of that stuff was going to get lost in translation. The visual aspect was going to get lost in translation. So I think I think the battle is over, and the screen and digitization are with us until whatever is the next.
And what do you sense is lost in that?
I don't know. There's a tactile experience that's lost. How much is that going to matter as time goes on? How much will what was lost when Gutenberg invented the printing press? Something was. You didn't go down to the village rock and listen to somebody tell a story. So that experience changed. Storytelling became a private one-to-one experience rather than a communal one. So something's always lost, and something else is always gained. And I don't know if you have kids or not, but once you have kids, there's this ongoing. You fall into this vortex, this psychodramatic vortex having to do with video games, and how much do you protect the kids from it, and how much do you try to control it, and all that. And I was listening to an NPR story some years ago where they were saying, for whatever it's worth, that in Scandinavia, for instance, they don't worry about this stuff. This is the future. The kids' minds are going to develop according to the new media, and their imaginations are going to develop according to the new media, and their ways of processing things and their ways of figuring things out are going to develop accordingly, and trying to control that is like trying to hold back the sea. The future's here, and I'm probably not going to be part of it for very long.
Well, I guess to bring some of that back to some of your fiction too, I guess so much of your writing does involve the pursuit of particular media objects. Particularly, I guess, I'm thinking in particular of Zeroville and Shadowbahn, but I think it's in what's in the Sea Came In at Midnight as well, and in Days Between Stations even. So I guess I don't know exactly if I have a question, a great one in this, but it does seem like a lot of the arc of your work or the fiction revolves around those sorts of quests for these particular media objects. Right. So I guess what do you see as happening to some of the concerns or the things that you're pursuing in fiction when it's without those objects to pursue?
Well, it's going to change, and the concerns are going to change, and also the source of drama is going to change. I mean, as if you watch old movies as much as I do, how many times do you ask yourself, how totally different would this plot be if these people had cell phones? As they're racing somewhere to tell somebody some crucial thing, and that all changes in this particular day and age, and so it has its own impact rather on the nature of dramatic conflict. When the big revelation, the big revolution has been has to do with communication. and the way that's been traumatized to a certain extent, with a certain element of what only 20 years ago would have been a kind of future shock, and it's now, it's as everyday and routine as can be. So the very basic, most fundamental, most profound sources of drama are not going to change. The way people interact and the way people feel about certain things, and it's just that these small little intersections of conflict, the roads no longer run that way, and the stories will adhere accordingly.
That feels like a great sort of bookend to where we started. We started with American Stutter all about a year and a half, where it feels like everything is in flux and is changing super fast. But then there are certain things that feel kind of eternal still, for sure. Right. Feels like a good stopping point, maybe. Thank you so much for spending time with us.
Well, listen, I want to thank you guys again for doing the book and for the introduction and for this interview. I really appreciate it.
Oh, you're very welcome. I know it's a dream come true for me to get to do this and to have this book out there. And listeners, the reason that Matt and I did this book is in part maybe for you to get it, but really it's for you to pick up the dozen or other works by Steve Erickson. That's the real stuff that y'all need to track down. And the book that we put together reveals how, as I hope this interview does, reveals how thought-provoking and wide-ranging his concerns and his interests are, and that's all just an amuse-bouche for the fiction. So please, run, don't walk, and pick all of that up as well. Yeah, but Steve, thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.
All right, well, welcome back. That was Steve Erickson talking to Mike Miley and Matt Luter. We hope you enjoyed the interview. We're here for a little bit of housekeeping, a few announcements, and other kinds of things. Contests. We got some contest details coming up here, and some other exciting stuff. So contests, we had a contest not too long ago for a Jessica Anthony Enter the Aardvark giveaway. We gave away 2 copies of that book. And congratulations to Thierry Normando of Canada for winning the Canadian edition of Enter the Aardvark, and to Jeff Downing in the US. We've got another contest to announce, Matt. This is a really fun one. We got an email out of the blue from a Twitter account called Howling Fanbot, which is a Twitter account that just randomly tweets out quotes from Infinite Jest. So through talking to Andrew from that account, he basically contacted us and said, are you guys familiar with David Jensen, who does art from Infinite Jest and This Is Water and other of Wallace's work? And we were like, yeah, of course. We've worked with him with the Journal and seen his stuff around all over the place. And he's like, I want to sponsor a contest in which 3 winners will be chosen to receive a framed 15 by 21 drawing of their choice from David Jensen's online store. And we were like, wow, that's really cool. How can we help? And he said, if we could just announce the contest. And basically the way you can enter is when we post on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook for this episode, the Steve Erickson episode announcement, you can like the post and comment something on the post in any of those 3 places, wherever you choose to engage. And we will enter you into the draw for the David Jensen contest. After about 2 weeks, we'll put a cap on it. 2 weeks after it releases, we will pick three random winners of the entrants, put you in touch with Andrew, and he will take your selection and he'll get your drawing shipped to you. You can visit David Jensen's Society 6 store, which is like kind of one of those online stores like Redbubble or Threadless. Society6.com/infinitejensen, and we'll put that link in our show notes. go check out his Infinite Jensen Twitter account as well. He's also on Instagram. He's got really great cartoony drawings, imaginings. He just came out with one of Madame Psychosis that's really, really awesome. So check out David Jensen. We have a few new patrons to announce, Matt. Actually, quite a few.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah. So, we put a lot of thought and work into this kind of reworking of the show name and all that stuff. And part of that was reconsidering what we could offer to patrons and something that would be, really a lot more exciting than what we had. And I think a bonus episode every month doubles your amount of Concavity Show episodes. So if you dig what we're doing, you want to support us and you want more of us, I sometimes find that hard to imagine, but that's okay. You can go check out our Patreon page. We'll link to that. We have Dennis Boyd joining the team. Thanks so much, Dennis. David DeGusta, Kristen Menasian, Josu Ele Barrieta. I had extensive emails with Josu about how to pronounce that, and they just said, only do my first name. Don't worry about the last name. But I took a shot. I took a shot, Matt. Thanks so much also to Quinn Taylor and to Anthony Brown. We so appreciate all of your support. Your names are on our Patreon page on our website as well. Matt, where can people get a hold of us?
Well, before we get to that, I want to mention a couple of other things, Dave.
Please do.
One, I was recently a guest on another podcast called Beyond the Zero.
Oh, yeah.
And if you want to go check that out, it's on Spotify. You can just search Beyond the Zero podcast. It's hosted by a guy named Ben out of Sydney, Australia. And I had a lot.
I listened to that.
A lot of fun talking books with him. It's relatively short.
Yeah, you were great
compared to our lengthy marathon podcast. The other thing I wanted to mention is we've had a couple of people write in recently talking about, or with questions about, different variants of the first edition or first printing of Infinite Jest.
Yeah, we really have.
So I've gotten to display some of my publishing knowledge and collectible antiquarian book collecting knowledge. And I would say if you have any questions about, you found an edition of Infinite Jest that maybe looks like a hardcover, but it was bound in paperback, or it has a copyright page that says first edition, but it's a paperback, or it doesn't have the Volman typo on the back, but it does say first printing, or it has the any kind of weird questions like that, write them in. I think we're going to do at some point a roundup and maybe go through and explain all of this, because I've really enjoyed getting to see other people's copies of the book that they've found. There are several different variants of the first edition of Infinite Jest, hardcover and paperback. So that's kind of an unexpected thing. Like, it's not really the focus of our show, but I do like talking about it.
Sure, and you're good at it. And I learned a lot from those email correspondences that I did not know about publishing and publishing techniques and what certain numbers on a publication page mean.
Yeah.
That I had no idea.
Yeah, so we'll talk more about that
cool.
at some point. But I think that's it. I actually just thought of one other thing is we recently announced the dates for the 2022 David Foster Wallace Conference in Austin. And that will be June 2nd through 4th. And our keynote speaker will be Jennifer Egan, Pulitzer Prize winner, author of Visit from the Goon Squad, Manhattan Beach, many other books. And I'm very excited about this event, obviously, and I really hope that, COVID calms down and we get to have a great conference. But you can go...
You would think that by June next year we'll be okay, right?
I don't know what to think. I'm hopeful. Vaccination rates continue to go up, but
it's nuts.
Who knows? But if you want to learn more about the conference, get in touch with me. I am the chair of the conference, and I'm the organizer of it. And like I say, we have our dates out there. We'll have hotel information, which will be pretty much the same as what we planned for 2020, but hoping to do it up even better for 2022 in Austin. So keep an eye on that.
Yeah, I can't wait. Should we also mention the Amsterdam conference right now too, while we're talking about Wallace conferences?
So we had originally planned the 2021 conference to be in Amsterdam in the summer, and back when the pandemic was really, really maybe at its worst point in January, we pushed that date back into October, thinking surely by the fall, people were already getting vaccinated, fall would be free and clear. And that hasn't played out to be entirely the case, but we are going ahead with the conference for now. We have papers accepted. We have people from the U.S. planning to attend. We have a bunch of European people registered, and I do think that we will have a conference that might be in masks, but there will be people giving papers at the Free University in Amsterdam.
October 28th through 30th this year. Our good friend Alar Dundalk is heading that up. He lives and teaches there. The conference is called 25 Years of Infinite Jest, the Afterlives and Influences of the Work of David Foster Wallace. So I won't be able to make it to that. I don't think you can either.
Right, I will not be there, but we do have more information about it on our website, dfwsociety.org, and we hope to have some good recaps and some summaries and some photos and videos as well after the event is over. But it's exciting just to have it back after having 2020 entirely shut down. And I do think 2022 will be a great event as well.
Can't wait. All right, where can the folks find us
So
now?
we are at Concavity Show on Twitter and Instagram, and we do have a Concavity Show Facebook page out there. Not as much engagement as I think Instagram is probably our best channel.
It is,
but I use Twitter a fair amount, and we're also at concavityshow@gmail.com. We love getting lengthy emails. If you're anywhere in the world, you don't use social media, and you want to talk to us, we reply to every single email. So please feel free to email us about anything. If you want to talk about the books that we've mentioned here on this episode or in previous episodes, or really, frankly, anything related to David Foster Wallace, I'd be happy to talk about.
Yep, or music or movies or video games, board games, any of that stuff.
Talk to Dave about.
It's all fair game.
Or if you want to talk about pencils or notebooks or
also those,
baseball,
stationery,
Antarctica. I like talking about stamp collecting,
Antarctica,
baseball cards. Lots of different.
You contain
topics.
multitudes, Matt Booker.
More just like jack of all trades, master of none.
Sure. You can also find us on Patreon. We're patreon.com/Concavity Show, and we also have a threadless store with you can get a Concavity Show shirt or a skateboard, pencil case, you name it. It's just the possibilities are more or less endless there of what you can get our logo on. So feel free to check that out. We're concavityshow.threadless.com. We'll put all those links in the show notes as usual. Thanks for sticking in for the Steve Erickson interview. You can stay tuned for our bonus episode coming out in about 2 weeks, in which Matt and I talked to Steve about his favorite novels of all time. We had a great time with that, so we're looking forward to everyone hearing that who wants to. So, adios. Stay safe out there.
Catch me now as I say, into darkness I thought to be extinct.
It's okay.
Okay. They write, Erickson's obscurity comes in part from the difficult categorizing his work. Just got to start over. Edit that out.
Sure.
All right, and edit out your laughing at me. I don't want to be laughed at.
At you.
Okay.
Yeah, okay. I say this to Fee all the time. Fee, you're so funny. She's like, no, I'm not. Don't.
What do you
say
think?
that.
I'm like a clown?
I'm like,
I'm here to entertain.
honey, I'm not laughing at you. I'm laughing because you have a good sense of humor.
All right.